Well, I think a fun piece of the book too is that we think about the intersection of the professional practice with the personal practice. So let me also preface that with saying that while Piper and I might share interesting ideas with you and your audience about these habits, we're not the master of these habits. On the contrary, we have learned things that we can do better ourselves, but it's thinking about the habits of where those intersections lie.
Welcome to Corwin's Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast with hosts Peter DeWitt and Michael Nelson. This podcast is from education leaders for education leaders. Every week, Peter, Mike, and our guests get together to share ideas, put research into practice, and ensure that every student is learning not by chance, but by design.
All right, Lindsay Prendergast and Piper Nichols, welcome to Corwin's Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast.
Thank you so much for having us. It's great to be here with you today.
It is truly an honor to join you.
Now, Michael and I met you. We met you last summer at the annual Visible Learning conference, and you both were like this just positive storm that came in. Like you were a force to be reckoned with when you were coming across the way to meet up with us. So it's really nice to see you here. We'd like to talk a little bit about, you have a couple of books. You have one that came out, you have one that's going to be coming out. And I think it would be great to talk about both because there are definitely commonalities and things to focus on. So the book that you had come out last year was actually called Habits of Resilient Educators. So Piper, talk to us a little bit about where this book came from and why you wanted to focus on it.
Yeah, so Lindsay and I had the opportunity to work elbow to elbow, much like you and Mike. And we were able to observe over 3,000 instructional rounds and professional learning sessions, PLCs together. We were kind of each other's thinking partner as we were supporting leadership teams in the district, in the schools, and then closely with the educators. Through that, we definitely saw some really exciting things taking place. It seems like there's always like doom and gloom about educators. And we just were really seeing some positive outliers. And we started to think about what is creating these resilient educators. They had come through the pandemic. Some of them were brand new and maybe had done their student teaching in the pandemic. Some of them were veteran teachers and just committed to staying. And so what were those habits that were kind of separating those that were fleeing the profession from those that were just continuing to thrive in the uncertainty? So I'll invite Linz, what else can you say about that?
Well, we can't have a conversation without at some point bringing up Harry Wong, who was
Yeah.
very, very instrumental for both of us in our early careers. So we often thought about those pieces that stood out in our learning from Harry many years ago. But again, as we watched these educators at varying ranges in their career, it was those that were really still thriving essentially at this difficult time. We're leaning hard on routines and habits and practices that they're just instilled. And it's not necessarily rocket science, new innovative things that we discovered. It's going back to the foundational skills that we felt like we benefited from developing in that time, and lifting out those pieces in the current context. So just a piece there that, again, we cannot have a conversation about our book without bringing up Harry. So.
Well, you've given a great anticipatory set. Our listeners right now, if they're in their car, they're leaning forward. They're like, okay, give us some. What might you be able to share with us right now in this moment? Because our listeners are on the edge of their seat.
Well, I think a fun piece of the book too is that we think about the intersection of the professional practice with the personal practice. So let me also preface that with saying that while Piper and I might share interesting ideas with you and your audience about these habits, we're not the master of these habits. On the contrary, we have learned things that we can do better ourselves, but it's thinking about the habits of where those intersections lie. So it starts out, for example, with purpose. Both of us have had the good fortune at our times in our careers of really grounding our work in our why. And we saw people drifting away from that in the pandemic, and that like loosening of that thread to their work was really causing them to feel that experience of burnout. So that's an introductory habit, for example, of really that is something that can nurture you and sustain you. And it sits in a place of both your personal well-being, but also your ability to feel confident and capable in your professional practice. So Pipe, I know you've got ideas there too.
Yeah, I just think that like Lindsay said, when we observe these habits, I wouldn't say that one rises above another, and that resilience really runs through them. And so we talk about resilience as the 10th habit, but it's all of these collective habits that really build that resiliency. And so we kind of laugh and we'll say, "Oh, I got to go back to the habit of goal setting or procedures and routines myself," right? Because it's not something that uh, any one educator or the two of us are perfect at. It's something that we're constantly kind of balancing and working through. So it was really the collective habits that were creating this resiliency. We talk a lot about resiliency is all like it's kind of a buzzword right now, and it can almost be negative or used negatively, like just be resilient. And meaning like I'm gonna give you a coffee cup and keychain and pat you on the back and send you on your way, and you just have to keep working hard. And that is not at all what resilience is. There's actually a science to resilience, and so these habits feed to that aspect of the profession.
I think, and that's great. I think sometimes because you both have started to say that you haven't mastered the habits yet, but I sometimes wonder if that's why we pursue them so strongly when we're writing and when we're doing work, because those are areas that we want to learn more about. Like, Michael and I right now with our long-term work, we're spending a lot of time looking at data and evidence and having those kind of conversations around multiple measures. That wasn't always a place where I mastered. And actually, I had a webinar this morning where I told the group that it was an area that was not an area of strength for me. And that's why I wanted to pursue it so much, because I felt like it was something that I wanted to learn more about. So I don't think it's strange at all that you would say these are habits that are really important, but we haven't mastered them yet, because I think that's why we actually pursue them in the first place as researchers and writers. So I appreciate that. Piper, one of the things you were just talking about was the whole idea of resilience. And I think any word can be used so much that it's like your favorite song when you first hear it, and then it's like, I don't want to hear that word again, ever again, right? Like fidelity and those kind of things.
Oh.
But and yeah, resilience has been used positively and negatively, but part of what you were talking about was the idea of well-being, and I think you hit it pretty you were pretty solid in what you said, which is give them a coffee mug and a keychain and pat them on the back. And that is something that's happened quite a bit when in the world of well-being. So I know that one of the things that you focus on in your book, the resilient educators part, is an environment that school leaders can help set up so you can focus on well-being. And there's been an explosion in well-being research over the past decades, but it's definitely been a boom since COVID. So what kind of environment, because I think leaders struggle with that. I think leaders will say we care about well-being, but at the same token they're like, she's such a hard worker, she even comes in on weekends, and it's a badge of honor. How can leaders set an environment where well-being are not just words that they use like resilience, but it's actually part of the culture that is established with teachers?
Could go and talk about this for days, Peter. That's a great question. And building on what Piper shared there about the idea that resilience in some cases has been used negatively against teachers, that's led us to the next book, which is coming out on habits of resilient leaders. And there are strong themes in that talk about the understanding for themselves of their own well-being, but also creating the environment that you just described where teachers can experience it. And I think for us, what we did do was learn an enormous amount ourselves as well about the reflection, the opportunities to understand human needs essentially in an environment like that. So you just mentioned something that really hits home for me, where they may say, oh, you know what, that teacher's got it though. They resilience is not even a need for them because they're so hardworking and they're dedicated and they're going to tie themselves in knots. And we have another phrase in this book that we say that is teaching sits at the intersection of mundanity and sainthood. And
Mhm.
it's that idea that as a society, even, we are susceptible to placing teachers in a position where you're expected to tie yourselves in knots, and that's just what you do. And yes, teachers are terribly giving people, wonderfully giving people, I should say, who likely got into the profession for a sense of value in the service aspect. So do leaders, for what it's worth. But leaders have an opportunity there to help them not literally drain themselves to below zero
Mhm.
and remove them of the capacity to be effective and feel good and experience well-being and feel positive, and that they can have a personal life and be rewarded and fulfilled in that aspect.
Mhm.
So case in point, toxic productivity is something we talk about. That I'm a signer upper. You want me to get involved, just ask, right? If we know that about a person who works for us, how do we then say, hey, look, I'm not going to ask you to do that because I
Mhm.
see how much you have on your plate right now. It might be fun for you, but we're going to look at that at a different time. So they can create those environments and those structures that help people manage their own boundaries.
Mhm.
Yeah, and Lindsay, I'll just add to that that one of the first boundaries we write about in the leadership book that comes out in June is actually the habit of boundaries. And so helping educators, leaders, make sure that they are managing their calendar so that the calendar doesn't manage them, and being a role model in that space. So, as the district leader or the building leader, not sending out emails on a Saturday morning or at 8 o'clock at night, because we all look at that timestamp. And so, when you're under somebody that is leading that way, it breeds this kind of that, toxic productivity, and really toxic culture. And so we talk about healthy boundaries. That doesn't mean it can be swung the other way, right? Everything in moderation. And so helping as a leader to prioritize and think about, a lot of times I've seen, and Lindsay and I've talked about this a lot, we've seen irate parents come into an office and maybe a teacher is meeting with a leader, and all of a sudden, the irate emotional situation takes over, and the leader runs with the emotion instead of saying, I'm going to give this permission to pause, and this teacher in front of me or this student, whatever the that is actually urgent. You're right in the midst of that, and providing some space for the emotions to die down, set up an appointment, um, make sure that the people feel seen, valued, and heard, but actually doing that by, I'm going to follow up with you. I want to do that, but also making the person, whether it's an educator that's, getting some feedback from you and you have an appointment with, they feel valued by their time as well. So there's some boundaries there that I think leaders need to be mindful of how they are showing up, and how they're modeling for the
Mhm.
educators and students in their building.
Well, you've made the switch to habits of resilient educators to habits of resilient leaders. So, congratulations on your second book that, as Piper said, looks to be out in June from Corwin. You talked about all of the interviews and the connections you made prior to Habits of Resilient Educators. What was the foundation and what did you do in preparation for this new book?
So they were actually, I would say this book was in our head before Habits of Resilient Educators was, incidentally. So what Piper described of the experience where we spent several years in one district every single day in different schools working with these leaders, we were directly hip to hip with the leaders themselves in these experiences. So when we designed the book, it sat in a space of saying that the teachers certainly we pulled out all of those trends and those patterns, it made sense to write that one first. But the other one for leaders was being written right alongside that. And it only, I think, became easier to pull out the salient points as we were then working on the first book and working out in schools continuously in other districts at the time and seeing even more evidence. So we just continue to gather those trends. We also have some incredible thought partners, and we pull from experiences, case in point, of seeing the two of you at ABL last year and listening into the conversations you were sharing in your presentation. So looking at all sorts of different research, but also our own experiences and the conversations directly with leaders that we work with as thought partners was really, it kind of poured out.
So I have a question for listeners who don't know a lot about you. What's your background? Because it plays a huge role in what we do. Like Michael is a former teacher and principal and superintendent of the year for Washington State, and worked with Washington Association of School Administrators. I have a teaching background, and I was a school building leader for 8 years. What is your background, and what led you to this place? So I'm going to start with you, Lindsay.
Sure. Yeah. So I have I am told, somewhat unusual approach into the leadership pathway because I started out getting a master's degree in school counseling.
Okay.
And I had a really unique and a very wonderful experience as my first role as an administrator, where I was both an assistant principal and the guidance counselor in a secondary setting. And people would always say to me, "Isn't that like a conflict of interest?" And I said, "Actually, I think it should be required."
Yeah.
Because the approaches that I learned in that counseling realm really led me to experience, I think, more strength in that social emotional aspect as a leader, and really thinking through those practices from a more human-centered approach. So that's a standout feature in my own path. My original career in teaching was in special education also. So that certainly, I would again advocate that everyone should have to spend some years as a special education teacher for so many reasons: the relationships, the pedagogy, the understanding of all the different learning styles, you name it. But those two lenses really, I think, shape a lot of the way that we think about our work in schools now.
I
So
want to come back to that for just a minute. Yeah, I taught inclusion for 7 out of 11 years, and I was the general ed teacher, but I learned a ton from working with a special ed teacher, co-teaching, like all of these things Hattie talks about. I'm like, we did that,
yeah.
that's
Mhm.
because but it was a wonderful experience, especially for those who may not have had the greatest pre-service teaching program. That on the job training is really awesome. And you made me think of my friend Tim Dawkins, is an assistant superintendent north of me in South Glens Falls, New York. And he was a school counselor before he got into administration. And he took some grief for that and ended up writing a guest blog for Education Week on why it was important, why we need to consider the importance of somebody who went from school counseling to administration. So you just made me think of that. So I think that's wonderful. Thank you. Piper, what about you?
Yeah, so I spent 11 years in the classroom, mostly gen ed. 3 of those years, I did teach multilingual learners. I was an EL teacher. I was in one district in Minnesota. I point that out because one thing that I've thought a lot about is, I was in Rochester, Minnesota, and home of Mayo Clinic. And why that is important is because it's really a science academic community, and they are all about their medical rounds. And one of my kids was in the hospital a lot for some chronic challenges. And I watched those medical teams, whether it was a medical student, a nurse, a surgeon, come together and collaboratively do their rounds for many years. And so then when John Hattie wrote his instructional rounds, it just I was like, oh, that totally makes sense. And we need to do more of this in education. I also was an instructional coach, director of um, uh, instructional coaches. I also was a professor of the ethnographers of language, so literacy junkie, and have been kind of in this coaching space for leadership for about a decade. And so I do have to say, though, the one thing I did that was a little brave and crazy was I went back to the classroom the year of the pandemic in Florida. I had a friend that was an administrator, and she said, you always wanted to go back because we, just like you said, Peter, like we learn these things, and it's not that we're great at it, and we can help and we can see the impact and as we learn, even in these coaching spaces. I wanted to take all that I'd learned just one more year back in the classroom, and it was kind of like grandma goes back to school. So I feel like in that space, I was able to really understand more about what the educators were really feeling, whether it was expectations or the technology changes. It was a really, really grounding year for me. I enjoyed it very much, and I also enjoy how that has impacted my thinking now.
Fantastic. Well, I'm gonna ask a question and then let Peter begin to wrap our time together up. The theme for season 9 of our podcast is kind of navigating leadership. And I know the two of you are very busy. And in the last year since your book came out, you've been busy connecting with audiences and participants and schools about the essence of your book. And I would love to hear a story or a soundbite from those presentations about your book that brought a smile to your face, or gosh, I wish that could have been included in the book. That story is a great story. If we ever rewrite this book, I want that in there. Something that our audience might glean from all of you've been all over doing these presentations about the book. So share one little snippet from that.
I'm thinking of one that happened to you, Piper, but if you have one, go for it.
Yeah, I actually was like super funny because we were in the Visible Learning Conference in your session, and the lady sitting
People were
next
talking
to
about
me,
you in our session. So that is a start so far, Piper. So keep going.
I know. No, we were in your session learning like great things, and we were just like, oh my gosh, we so connected with what you were saying. But the lady next to me, she keeps kind of staring at me, and finally she pulls out our book. And she's like, you're the authors. I've read this and it's made such an impact, and we're doing a book study at our school, and it's really changing our mindsets. We wrote one of the 9th habits that we wrote about was navigating negativity. And she said, we've really really dove into this, and would you come on and do just an introduction to the book study? So it just was a fun connection for us, but it actually happened in your session.
Oh, that's very good. I'm glad we brought you guys together.
Yes.
Yes,
We
thank
planned
you.
that. We said, you need to sit here because we believe Lindsay and Piper are going to be come in and they're going to sit there. So yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Do you
All
mind
right, Lindsay.
This
Yeah,
is
do you have something, Lindsay?
I'd love to, because this is one that did happen to Piper, but we brought it up in numerous other instances, and it really just kind of takes the room. You can hear the right. So we have an intro slide we will often share that's a metaphor for whatever teachers tend to think it may be a metaphor for, but you can get the idea when I tell you that it's an image of a freighter, a ocean crossing freighter with its cargo, and it's being tipped over in the midst of an ocean swell. And so we think about this metaphor of what does that relate for you to the path of teaching and current environment we live in. And people were chit-chatting around and sharing their different ideas. You can kind of imagine likely what many of them were. But an instructional coach shared with Piper, she said that makes me think of the hidden cargo, the one that nobody sees.
Oh.
And right? Just silent gasps. It's like, wow, everybody related to that. And that just really struck us as an example, again, of what teachers and coaches and leaders are all carrying with them that we don't see.
Well, Peter, I think we just need to sit next to each other and go to a session of Lindsay and Piper, and hopefully the person next to us might pull out a copy of Leading with Intention and say, gosh, I know Peter. I don't know who the other guy is, but I do know Peter. So I think we need to try and do that.
That's not true. I think your metaphor, Lindsay, is a perfect one to end on. And, thank you so much to both of you. It was so important to hear your backgrounds too. because your first book is doing really, really well. Your second one is going to for sure.
Absolutely.
You guys have such great energy, and you bring. I love that I'm glad that we asked you about your backgrounds, because it also provides just a completely different lens and a deeper lens to the work that you're bringing. Lindsay, I completely agree with you. Like special ed, school counseling, absolutely they make you stronger in the work that you're doing, right? And Piper, you've had about 18 different positions that
Yeah.
you've been a part of, but instructional coach, like that's the one job that I never had that I wish that I did. We didn't have instructional coaches when I was teaching, and I wish that we did, because instructional coaches were really fun. That just is a fantastic position to be in too. So thank you to both of you for being on the Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast. Congratulations on all of the great work that you're doing, and we look forward to reading your next book, which is going to be The Habits of Resilient Leaders. But until then, our audience, even if you are leaders, it's really important to read Habits of Resilient Educators too, because even though it's about resilient educators, leaders are educators too, and you can learn a lot about what your teachers are experiencing. So thank you again for being on our podcast.
Thank you so much. It's been an honor.
We appreciate it.
Peter, we just had the dynamic duo, Lindsay and Piper, and their book, Habits of Resilient Educators, and then their book that's coming out in June, Habits of Resilient Leaders. They shared some great insights for our audience today.
Yeah, they have a lot of energy. We talked in the podcast about how we first met them last summer at Visible Learning. And that's very engaging to see from facilitators. But I also think that energy level goes into the books that they're writing. And, having that conversation about writing from a place where we want to learn from, I believe that's something that the two of them are doing, and that's always such a good space to write from.
And, exactly. I love the story that that brought out chapter 9 of their book on negativity, and how one person used that chapter with a book study, and how by studying their work it began to transform the culture within their school, and their individual habits, but it's also the collective habits. And I just thought that was a really powerful story, that the work that they're producing really is making an impact on people in the building, and therefore making a fundamental difference for students. And that's a really true testament to the thoughtfulness in which they're putting words on paper and collecting insights for people. And I just wanted to continue asking questions, to be honest. I wanted to know, are those habits situational? Is the negativity like when you're in certain groups, when you go to a staff meeting, or is the negativity when you're meeting with your grade level team? Does situation change the insights of those habits? I wanted to dive in a little bit deeper around that.
And those are really good questions. And you have to wonder, they are probably things that they explore within the book. One piece that I appreciate from the two of them is that they seem to learn from and write from an empathetic standpoint. So, you've read books where it's coming from an expert place, or it's coming from a researchy place, and you kind of feel like you're judged for not doing the work that you're reading about. You're trying to learn about the work, but you're reading it and you're feeling judged. Their perspective comes from an empathetic place of, we're trying to, we understand the workload, we understand the struggles that you're feeling, and here are some things to be able to think about, and here are things to engage in. And that's such a great perspective to come from when you're writing a book, because it makes it less, the reader doesn't have to go through the judgy part. The the reader feels engaged with it. So that's fantastic.
Yeah, truly true to our form of our theme for this season is navigating, and you could see how they're navigating their thoughts, how they're navigating the writing between one book and two books, how they're navigating audiences as they present their information. Leadership is about navigation, and I love the theme for this season. It sure is coming out in our in the guests that we have had so far. So
Yes.
a great
Well,
as always.
always good to see you, Michael. And, for those of you that are listening, we are looking for your feedback. Let us know how we're doing. Let us know any feedback that you have. But we're honored that you would take time to listen to our Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast. And Michael, I'll see you soon.